content of the food, or even the carbohydrate content of the food. I don't know it as precisely as that because the methodologies vary. All right, so some examples. I'm sure you know this stuff. Potatoes have a very high glycemic index in most instances, but people are working really hard. The agricultural industry is working really hard to come up with some low GI varieties. In my books, everything was once low GI. Nature's packaging produces low GI carbohydrates. And what we've done over the course of time and studies on breeding is produce higher and higher GI foods. So white bread, but also wholemeal bread, because the particle size is the same, the rate of digestion is just the same. Most rices, like especially jasmine rice, has a GI as high as a glucose load, about 100. It's sticky rice. Most breakfast cereals, even the whole grain breakfast cereal, because they've been processed, they've been cooked in lots of water, lots of hydration takes place. They then get rolled, and they get flaked, and they get puffed, and they get toasted. Is it any surprise that at the end of all that, the carbohydrates are really easy digested and absorbed, even if the fiber's there, with a few exceptions? And of course, most low-fat snacks that the food industry has provided willingly at the demand of the medical profession. You know, most low-fat snacks are puffed and popped and you name it, and so of course they're easy to digest and absorb. On the other hand, on the left, no, on the right, your right, we've got those that are considered low GI, just for convenience, for the help of, you know, just to help people. We have to draw the line somewhere. So pasta and noodles, most shapes, cooked normally, not cooked for an hour, not sloppy, not canned spaghetti, but normal spaghetti, normal pasta and noodles usually have a lowish GI. Legumes always around the 40 mark. Even when canned, lentils and things are still low GI. Dairy products are usually low GI, even when they're sweetened, like ice cream and yogurt. And of course, most fruit and vegetables, with a few exceptions which really don't matter when it comes to the fruits, but it do matter in the case of potatoes. So potatoes is an important exception to that rule. Some rices like basmati and some other rices that are produced in India, which have a sort of dry texture, they're not sticky. You can actually see this difference. And some breads, in Australia we know the GI of most of the breads, and there are breads on the market that have a GI of 45, 40, and people like them and buy them in large amounts because they're nice breads, but they're denser and they have a coarser texture, and they're made by more traditional old-fashioned methods. And some breakfast cereals. So Kellogg's in Australia produces a product called Guardian, which is for your heart. I don't know whether you have it here. And it's got psyllium fibre added, which is a viscous fibre. And viscous fibre, I'm going to come back to later, helps to slow down the rate at which digestion takes place. All right, so one of the most important take-home messages today is that sugary foods are not the demons when it comes to the glycemic index of foods. All right, starchy foods, modern starchy foods in general have a higher glycemic index because they're more rapidly digested and absorbed than the sugary foods. So, all right, so glycemic potency of carbohydrate is a property of the food, not of the person. Does that make sense? It's a property of the food. So people can be variable, but the food's not variable. We've got a given food. So the glycemic potency depends on the extent to which that food is emptied from the stomach, the speed of digestion of that food and its carbohydrate, and the speed of absorption of that food, the breakdown products of starch digestion or sugar digestion. So all these things are influenced to a huge extent by the gelatinization of the starch. Is that a term you're familiar with? Gelatinized starch? Okay, these they're light microscopy photographs of starch molecules, starting off with the raw starch granules, which are like little grains of sand. And when you you add enough water and enough heat, they begin to hydrate, and the starch moves from inside the granule to the watery solution, and the ghosts are left behind, the ghosts of the starch granule. And if you keep cooking and there's enough water, then all the starch becomes solubilized and really easy to digest and absorb. And what's happening is that the food industry now produces most of our foods in this fourth panel, whereas originally there were more foods like this in the second panel. In fact, pasta is here, and lentils and soybeans and all the legumes, chickpeas are in this one. So really, the gelatinization of starch is in the hands of the food industry, and therefore the glycemic index is in the hands of the food industry. All right, so how relevant is the glycemic index? You're using the area under the curve, and that's a method of averaging. What about the glucose spike? Some studies suggest it's the actual height of the spike which produces the harm in people with diabetes. And what we did in this study that was published last year is take all foods that we'd tested. 1,126 foods were in our database. We tested them all in 50-gram carbohydrate portions, all in 10 different people. And so each dot is the glycemic index of one food, all right, measured in 10 people. And what you can see there is that as the glycemic index increases, the peak plasma glucose increases in a way that is predictable. And if you've got a glycemic index of 40, then the peak glucose is only 6 millimolar, which is 6 times 20, 120 milligrams. Whereas if you've got a glycemic index of 80, then the peak glucose is about 8. All right? And some people say that a person with diabetes should never have a glucose level higher than 8. Okay. All right. So what about people with type 1 diabetes? This is a study that actually comes from Australia by dietitians, Diabetes Care 2008, and this is continuous glucose monitoring, and that takes a blood glucose in the interstitial fluid every 5 minutes, I think, every
5 seconds, then it averages out, and you get a data point every 5 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, so if you heard that, it's pretty frequent. So this is the difference between a high GI meal. It was just bread and some sort of glucose solution. And this is a low GI meal, which was a low GI bread on our market. And it was white bread, by the way. It had a viscous fibre added, and so it's on the market, and it's marketed especially at kids. And you can see the difference there is this peak rise is 6 millimolar here and about 3 millimolar here. It's a really big difference which predicts complications. And if you use the continuous glucose monitor and it generates the average glucose over time, then you can see over 24 hours, these 20 children, the average glucose level is significantly different and important in terms of their complications. All right, what about glycemic load? Everybody says to me, you know, what about glycemic load, Jenny? Isn't it more relevant than glycemic index? Well, yes and no, and I'll talk more about it as we go along. So the glycemic index is a ranking of the glycemic potential of carbohydrates per unit of carbohydrate. Glycemic load is the glycemic potential per serving of food. So all we've done to generate glycemic load is multiply the glycemic index as a percentage, so over 100, times the grams of carbohydrate per serving. So let me show you some examples. A GI of an apple is 40, so glycemic load, its glycemic load is 40% times 15, because there's 15 grams approximately in one apple, and you've got 6 grams of glycemic load. So think of glycemic load as the grams of carbohydrate adjusted for its glycemic potential. Does that make sense? Adjusted? So think of it as a measure of carbohydrate, only a measure of its glycemic potential of that carbohydrate. So The glycemic load of one slice of bread is 70% times 15, which gives you 11. So you can generate the glycemic load of the whole diet in an individual, and in most Western countries, you know, some people, you know, might have as low as 60 and other people might have as high as 180, all right, in their self